Let's talk about, your time on the road, as we lead up to this show. Um, are you riding with Oli, town to town, or is he at a different level? So you're riding with somebody else? I mean, he is your partner, and we wrestling fans have been led to believe that a lot of the guys who work together ride together. Was that the case for you here as well?
For the Georgia towns, and I had moved back to Rome, which was, I could have moved to Atlanta, but I could stay at my granny's for nothing. So I went back to Rome. And so Ole on the Georgia towns obviously would make them out of his house, which was down in Atlanta. And I would make them out of Rome. So we didn't travel together. But when we went on tour up to Ohio and West Virginia and all that, we would fly into Columbus, get a rent-a-car, ride together, and make the loop. So half and half, we were traveling together.
Let's recap sort of what you're doing on the road here. We did talk a little bit about, what you were doing in terms of you were working shows and you weren't, just waking up in your hometown for Thanksgiving. On the 14th, you're in Columbia, South Carolina at the Township Auditorium. Of course, you're in a multi-man tag team here. Tully Blanchard, Ole Anderson, and Arn Anderson taking on Dusty, Magnum, and Billy Jack. The very next day, you're in Charleston, South Carolina, the same matchup, except this time Tully's out and Ric Flair's in. The very next day, you're going to be working a shot with a spot where you're again teaming with Ole and Ric Flair. But this time you've got Terry Taylor, Pez Whatley, and Ron Garvin as your opponent. 2 days later, you're down in Memphis. This time it's a bunkhouse match, and Jerry Lawler's involved. The day after that, or 2 days later rather, you're back in South Carolina, Greenwood, South Carolina. Once again, a big multi-man match here. 2 days after that, you're in North Carolina and Raleigh, and you're working with Dusty Rhodes straight up. 2 days after that, you're in West Virginia, and this time you're teaming with Ric Flair to take on Dusty and Magnum. The very next day, you're working against Dusty and the Road Warriors. This time you're teaming with Ole and Ric Flair. The very next day, you're in Baltimore, Maryland. Again, Dusty and the Road Warriors on one side. This time, Tully Blanchard, Ole, and Arn on the other. The following day, back in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And then 2 days after that, it's just November 27th. So the day before Starrcade, you're not in the Carolinas. You're actually in Miami, Florida, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. It's Dusty Rhodes, Magnum TA, and Wahoo McDaniel taking on Ric Flair, Ole, and Arn. And that's November 27th at Convention Hall for Championship Wrestling from Florida. And the next day it's Starrcade. So you're a road warrior, to say the least, including, on the 2 week lead up here, all over the South Carolina market, all over North Carolina, West Virginia, Baltimore, Miami. And now you're here for the big show, Starrcade 85. The schedule at this point got to be more grueling than what you were used to when you were working in, the Pensacola market, because they're not all just local drives. You're sort of bouncing around, but a long haul like that from Miami to Atlanta, you're not making that by car, right? Does Crockett have a plane by this point, or are you flying commercial, or what's that look like?
I think that would have probably still been commercial. And that would have been, you wake up after the Miami show. The difference would have been you wouldn't have had a 6 a.m. flight. You wouldn't have had a ticket that was virtually worthless if you missed that flight. You would have probably had let's just say a 10 o'clock in the morning, maybe 10, 11 o'clock with a backup or two. And, you'd have got up mid-morning. We would have flown to Atlanta, got to rent a car, went to the gym. You'd be surprised the difference in having an 11 o'clock flight in the morning and having a 6 a.m., especially when you're on last and you don't get in your bed until, 1 o'clock, and now you got to try to wind down. You know, in your head, you got, okay, I got 1 to 4 to sleep. If I get to sleep this second, and that thought alone, because on the road, you've got to pretty much condition yourself and, you know, into a thought process. That thought alone that I've got 3 hours, if I get to sleep right now, is the one thing that'll keep you up the whole night. You'll just be watching the clock because you see that your time is winding down. The difference is when you're 25 years old, who cares? You know, you didn't even sit down in those days. Most of us lay down because of all the hype and all the great things that are going on. Hey, I wrestled Dusty Rhodes in the Road Warriors tonight. You know, laying down in the bed and going into a coma is not that big a deal on the Richter scale. You know, I'm reliving the match and reliving being in there with those guys and the reaction they got and the reaction we got. Just, man, it overrode needing sleep, put it to you that way.
Let's talk about, you know, big show day here. You know, this is a wrestling tradition at this point, you know, wrestling around Thanksgiving, in or on Thanksgiving. And this is, you know, not too terribly long into your wrestling career. What's a typical show day like? You know, that day you wake up in Rome, I assume, or where are you living at this point?
No, I was already, real briefly, I went to Crockett in March the 5th. I started of 1985. I was there a few months. We were sent down to Georgia. We were brought back for the big summer show at the Charlotte Outdoor Memorial Stadium. And I was back in Charlotte there. So I would have woke up in Charlotte. We would have made the trip down to Atlanta for that show, but I was living back in Charlotte at that time.
So, you know, this is a Thanksgiving show. You're not in Rome to do any sort of Thanksgiving with the fam, or at that point, had you already gotten used to sort of the Thanksgiving tradition?
Well, I'm sure that we had a show somewhere around Charlotte the night before Thanksgiving. That would have just been a get up in the morning and early and just drive down there, do the show. And then depending on where the next night was, I mean, it wasn't like you built to this big show and then you had a day or two off and to collect yourself. You just kept trudging forward and kept plowing forward, and business was on fire. And when those arenas are full, you don't stop to think, hey, when was the last time I had a day off?
Right.
You didn't want a day off.